For over 20 years, a genocide has unfolded in the dark. Behind China's glowing facade is a communist regime operating with a goal to destroy a peaceful faith. Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong, is an ancient spiritual practice centered on meditation and the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. In the 1990s, the practice was so popular in China that it estimated that 1 in every 15 people in the country practiced it. The Chinese Communist Party even praised it for the health benefits brought to Chinese citizens. That is, until party head Jiang Zemin single-handedly declared that a popular interest in spirituality stood at odds with the CCP's societal control. What began in 1999 was a brutal and systematic persecution of innocent people, kidnapped, jailed, and tortured in secret. Untold numbers have died in the hands of the Chinese state. Founded in the year 2000, the mission of U.S.-based nonprofit Friends of Falun Gong is to support practitioners' freedom of belief through advocacy, providing information, and government work. The Friends of Falun Gong Human Rights Award was created in 2008 to honor those who have made significant contributions toward ending the persecution. Previous recipients include David Mattis, David Kilgore, and Gao Zhisheng. The 2023 Friends of Falun Gong Human Rights Award is presented to Nina Shea, Director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, in recognition of her achievements and outstanding contributions in this field. Her dedication towards ending the genocide of Chinese citizens who practice Falun Gong and the horrid crime of forced organ harvesting continues to make a significant impact in awakening thousands to this ever-serious human rights issue at hand. Nina Shea, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my total honor. I'm delighted to be here.
Nina, when it comes to human rights work and freedom of belief, you've been a strong defender and advocate for this for decades. What about Falun Gong sort of caught your attention?
I learned about Falun Gong about 20 years ago, and I was horrified about the intensity of the persecution that I was hearing about. And it was almost unbelievable that a government would do a massive roundup in this day and age and send an entire spiritual group of Chinese people, their own citizens, or nationals, I should say, to labor camps, which was what was happening in those days. And it's still happening, but this was massive. And hundreds of thousands that we were hearing about. And at the same time, it was all, we started hearing here about forced organ harvesting. And that was the first time I even heard of the concept. And it was almost too bad to be true. It was almost unbelievable on its face, but it was persistent. And at the same time, there were people, heroes, giants in the field like David Kilgore and David Mattis up in Canada, who were starting to do the documentation, looking at the sudden rise of transplant centers in China and the number of beds and the fact that there was no voluntary donor list at all. That was over there, and it raised the questions, it begged the question, where are these organs that are being transplanted coming from? So there was this boom industry, this brand new industry in China rising up at a massive scale, and at the same time reports of disappearances and mass imprisonment or detention in labor camps without any due process for Falun Gong, and that these Falun Gong practitioners were healthy people, they were optimal donors for transplants. You can connect the dots, and it started to look very, very bad for the Chinese. So for the Chinese government, for the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. It struck me that there's absolutely no oversight of these labor camps. I'm a a lawyer. I had just graduated from law school and was conscious that you have a need. Every country has a need for oversight of their prisons and detention facilities because abuse, it has every opportunity there. That's when that first caught my eye. At that time, there was a massive, as you know, a disinformation campaign by the Chinese Communist Party against Falun Gong. This group that we in America had never heard about before, we suddenly heard at the same time who Falun Gong was, what they're known for, their spiritual practices, their physical and body-mind practices. So we learned that at the same time we were learning that this was an evil cult, that this was a security risk, that the government was very alarmed, and yet Jiang Zemin at the time seemed so moderate, seemed so friendly and jovial, and wanted to open up markets and be vastly different from the Maoist period and from the Soviet period that we knew very well. It was hard to believe. It was hard for others to believe when we started talking about it. We started getting evidence and more evidence. Now things are different.
Nina, but as you mentioned, the evidence is actually there. So when we talk about forced organ harvesting and just how cruel this is, it's not black market like it is in some countries where it's equally as outrageous, but this is state run by the government. How do you think history will reflect on this moment?
It is a hideous practice. It's very creepy. The first thing that pops into my mind is the stories of Dr. Mengele in the Holocaust and using prisoners as medical experiments. It's unbelievably cruel, and that it's happening on a massive scale, industrial scale. It's shocking. It's frightening because when you follow the science and don't have any ethical grounding, this is where it leads. And it shocks me in particular because I am aware that American medical institutions and hospitals are playing a role here. Maybe unwittingly, but they have their heads in the sand. There is now undeniable evidence, credible evidence that this is going on, and credible evidence that the Chinese Communist Party lies about it. And we now have acknowledged that regarding the Uyghur Muslims. It would not be surprising if they are guilty of genocide in one area, that they'd be guilty of this kind of atrocity towards another group entirely.
Why do you think, or why should freedom of belief matter in a world that just seems to be becoming more secular?
Well, I've spent my entire adult life, my entire career, looking at religious freedom, monitoring it around the world, making sure it's a pillar of American foreign policy. Since the United States is a superpower, we have inordinate influence on other countries, and we will affect freedoms and religious freedom whether we act or not. And I think it's extremely important because it is so personal. People are seekers of the truth, and all human beings actually have an innate desire to seek the truth and meaning in their lives. And religion and spiritual beliefs are organized for that purpose. You know, the part of how we are hardwired, and not everyone is called to be a dissident or to be an activist in some way, but everyone is called to find meaning in their life and to find a set of beliefs to live by. And that's what's so insidious about this, because it affects everyone. And in fact, in China, it is affecting every religious group there, whether it's the Uyghur Muslims, the Tibetan Buddhists, the Christians, or Falun Gong.
So you sort of touched upon it. One thing that I think sort of separates Falun Gong from the rest is because it was a relatively newer practice. As you mentioned, when the propaganda came out defaming it, like everybody knows who a Muslim is, who a Tibetan Buddhist is, who a Christian is. Falun Gong people weren't really familiar with it. So I guess, what sort of obstacles did you face 20 years ago when you realized it, yet so many others didn't?
Well, when I heard about it and started looking into it, I realized there was something there, and it was so horrifying that we couldn't ignore it. We had to delve deeper. And it was, you run into a brick wall because there's no transparency. And so I had to enlist, I was trying to enlist, and others were trying to enlist American government, members of Congress, medical people, medical sector. There wasn't a lot of confidence that this was true. And it was difficult to explain because on the one hand, you had the Chinese Communist Party putting out just massive volumes of disinformation and propaganda, denouncing Falun Gong, demonizing them. Also, Falun Gong was an indigenous Chinese movement and based on Asian Chinese philosophy and principles and practices, which no one ever heard of here, very few. And in fact, it was a new movement. It started in the early 90s, one that skyrocketed. So it was very difficult to start to explain that this is a practice that has risen out of ancient Chinese culture, whether it's Taoism and Buddhism and meditation, and that the Chinese government is lying. It was difficult to explain who they were, who Falun Gong is, in the face of this all of government onslaught against them.
Nina, you've actually since advocated for the persecution against Falun Gong, to be classified as a genocide. Tell us about that.
I believe that there is evidence of genocide here in the way the Chinese Communist Party went after Falun Gong. Typically, in a genocidal situation, you have to have two things. One is under law, under international law, an expression of intent to eliminate a group, in this case, a religious group. And you have to have evidence not of a total annihilation of that group, because that's the whole point of international law, is to avoid getting to that stage. But you have to have evidence of serious bodily harm. We have both of those elements in this situation. You have Jiang Zemin, the president of China, calling it was 1999, for the elimination, the total elimination of Falun Gong, and establishing an extra-legal infrastructure within the party to carry that out. At the same time, you have massive arrests, no oversight, the detention camps, disappearances, documented killings where the family members would be presented with a box of ashes of their loved ones, maybe weeks, months after they were taken away. And these reports, and not only reports of speculation that they were victims of forced organ harvesting, but testimony from doctors and other prisoners and guards that this was happening, and testimony that there is organ screening, blood type taking as a routine basis on these prisoners of conscience.
What can people do once they realize what you have just laid out? Because I think the vast majority of Americans, when they hear this, are going to be outraged. What should they do? What can they do?
Well, I think that the first thing that has to happen is that we have to recognize it as a government. We have to make sure we're not involved and supporting this. And I have seen lists of 344 organ transplant surgeons who were trained in this country from China, trained by our own medical schools and hospitals, or have been supported. These transplant centers have been supported by our transplant sector in some way, either with joint research or research money or other kind of foundational support. And that continues to this day. And I think that has to stop, but it's not going to stop until we can't export our ethics or lack of ethics, be ethical here and then go abroad or send our funding and scholarship abroad. to do something, partake in something so hideous. So we need to have a government recognition of this and a block of this. There's a bill that overwhelmingly passed in the House that needs to become law, the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting law. That's a start. And I think that actually, with or without the law, the President and Secretary of State can order a complete stop on this exchange and support.
Nina, how concerning is it that the CCP's tentacles, we know for sure that they stretch into our universities, K Street, into the Capitol and beyond, think tanks. How concerning is this?
I think it's very concerning. I think that the Chinese Communist Party is sending agents here, sending police here, establishing a police station in the heart of Manhattan to spy on, intimidate, and perhaps kidnap Falun Gong practitioners. There were 2 arrests made this year by the FBI. I read the indictment. Falun Gong is mentioned 13 times in that indictment. That's who they were targeting. They were also targeting some other dissidents here and there, but as a group, Falun Gong was being targeted. It's quite clear, and harassed by these, intimidated by these agents. So they are here. They want to silence Chinese expats and Chinese students. They don't want discussion about what's going on. They don't want criticism. They won't tolerate it. They don't want more evidence coming out. So I think it's very concerning. I am heartened by the arrests in New York. I know it's much more extensive than that. I have spoken personally to Chinese nationals of all religions who are here in this country, who have experienced being spied on, being followed, being photographed right here on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. China is spreading this and wants to in an effort to promote its narrative that it is the model that should be imposed on the world.
Nina Shea, thank you.
Thank you.